July 1877. The war, which the headquarters in St. Petersburg had planned as a quick, victorious stroll to the south, suddenly stumbled. And it stumbled not over an impregnable fortress erected by generations of the best engineers. It stumbled over a small, dusty, unremarkable town at the crossroads of Balkan roads. Plevna, a name that almost no one in Europe knew until that hot summer, and which, in a few weeks, would become synonymous with the term meat grinder in all European languages. To understand how the army of a great empire became bogged down in blood under this little town for 5 whole months, one must look at the map and at how people read this map. The Russian army, under the command of Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, triumphantly crossed the Danube. The vanguard detachments of General Gurko were unstoppably rushing south toward the Balkan mountains, to Shipka. It seemed that the Ottoman Empire was falling apart from the very first blow. The Bulgarian population greeted the Russian regiments with flowers and tears. Euphoria blinds no worse than gunpowder smoke. In a state of this euphoria, the Russian command made a classic textbook mistake, for which infantry always pays with their blood in war. Carried away by the offensive in the center, they left their right flank practically wide open. There, to the west, lay Plevna. It was a vital crossroads. From here, routes led to Rus, to Sofia, to the crossings over the Danube, and to the Balkan passes. The town lay in a lowland, surrounded by gentle, low hills overgrown with vineyards and cornfields. No stone walls, no bastions, an open, bare place. The Russian command dispatched a detachment under General Schilder Schuldner simply to occupy the crossroads. It was considered a mere formality. The detachment moved slowly, without conducting proper reconnaissance. The soldiers suffered from the July heat, stretching out along the dusty roads. No one was in a hurry, because Plevna was considered empty. And it was indeed empty. But 200 kilometers to the west of it, in the fortress of Vidin, was a man who read the map much better than the Russian headquarters did. His name was Osman Pasha, a 45-year-old Ottoman general, a veteran of the Crimean War and the suppression of uprisings in Crete and Serbia. A silent, harsh man, fanatically devoted to his duty, possessing a cold, analytical mind. As soon as the Russians crossed the Danube, Osman Pasha understood what Petersburg failed to grasp. He realized that if he occupied Plevna, he would drive a wedge right into the side of the Russian army. He would overhang their communications, cut them off from the crossings, and halt their entire dash beyond the Balkans. The threat from the flank would force the Russians to stop, but Plevna was 200 kilometers away. For a 19th century army, that is a very long journey. Osman Pasha accomplished the nearly impossible. He mobilized his corps, about 15,000 elite, battle-hardened soldiers, and drove them on a forced march to the east. It was an exhausting trek. The July heat in the Balkans dries the earth to the hardness of stone. The men marched for 12 to 14 hours a day. Dust hung over the columns in an impenetrable cloud. Soldiers collapsed from heatstroke. Horses wheezed. The artillery was dragged at the very limits of human strength. Osman Pasha gave no quarter, neither to himself nor to his men. He understood that the clock was ticking not in days, but in hours. Whoever entered Plevna first would dictate the terms of the entire campaign. On July 7th, Old Style, 1877, at dawn, the vanguard units of Osman Pasha entered Plevna. The town was secured. The Turks, barely breathing from exhaustion, immediately, without lying down to sleep, began digging trenches on the heights surrounding the town. The shovel in this war would become just as important a weapon as the rifle. And Osman Pasha was a master of earthen fortification. General Schilder Schuldner's Russian detachment, the very one marching to occupy the empty town, arrived exactly 1 day late. On the evening of that same day, the Russian vanguards approached the hills east of Plevna and unexpectedly came under dense rifle fire. Schilder Schuldner could not believe his eyes. Where did the Turks come from? According to intelligence reports, there should have been no large enemy forces within a 100-kilometer radius. The Russian general, raised in the traditions of the old school, assumed that he was facing a random, small detachment of Bashi bazooks or a local garrison that could be swept away with a single decisive attack. He did not conduct deep reconnaissance. He did not wait for the arrival of all his forces and artillery. He gave the order to attack the very next morning. It was the morning of July 8th, the morning of the First Battle of Plevna. The Russian regiments, the Arkhangel-Ogorodsky, Kostromskoy, and Volогодsky, went into the attack according to the classic manuals mastered since the times of Suvorov and the Napoleonic Wars. Thick skirmish lines, followed by closed columns, advancing at full height with fixed bayonets to the beating of drums. The maxim, "The bullet is a fool, the bayonet is a fine fellow," was deeply embedded in the subconscious of the Russian officer corps. It was believed that a resolute bayonet charge would break the spirit of any enemy. But Osman Pasha had prepared a reception that entirely erased these notions. On the hills around Plevna, hiding in the thickets of corn and vineyards, sat the Turkish infantry, armed with the latest technology. And here we come to a crucial detail without which it is impossible to understand the tragedy of Plevna, the technological gap. The primary weapon of the Russian infantry was the Kernka rifle, and in the best units, the Berdan rifle. These were reliable, but not the most rapid-firing systems. The Turkish army, equipped through British and American contracts, held Peabody Martini rifles in their hands. The caliber was 11.43 millimeters, a heavy lead bullet that, at close range, did not just pierce a man, it shattered bones into dust and inflicted wounds from which there was almost no chance of survival, given the medicine of the time. But the main factor was the rate of fire. A Turkish soldier could unleash up to 10 to 15 rounds per minute. In addition, part of the Turkish infantry, especially the guards, possessed Winchester repeating rifles, which created a dense wall of fire at a distance of 200 meters. When the Russian columns marched across the open field toward the village of Grivitsa and the Bukovlak heights, the Turks let them come closer and then opened fire. This was not a firefight. It was a slaughter. The density of the Turkish fire was such that Russian officers later wrote in their reports, "Lead flew like hail in a thunderstorm. The air hummed continuously." The heavy Peabody Martini bullets pierced right through the thick Russian lines. Soldiers fell by the dozens, but discipline drove them forward. The Arkhangel-Ogorodsky regiment, taking heavy casualties, nevertheless broke into a section of the Turkish positions. A brutal bayonet melee began. In close combat, the Russian soldier was terrifying, and the Turks wavered in this sector. Several trenches were taken. The Russians reached almost the very outskirts of Plevna. It seemed the town would fall, but this was an illusion. Osman Pasha, stationed at his command post, cold-bloodedly sent fresh reserves into the battle. The Russians had no reserves. Schilder Schuldner had thrown almost everything he had into the attack. The exhausted, bleeding Russian battalions found themselves under the crossfire of fresh Turkish Tabors battalions. They began to run out of ammunition. They had to retreat under the same murderous fire across the open field, leaving behind their dead and wounded. By the evening of July 8th, the first battle for Plevna was over. The Russian troops withdrew. The results were shocking. Out of the 8,000 men who went into the attack, almost 3,000 were killed or wounded. About 75 officers were left on those fields. Kostromskoy and Vologodsky regiments lost a significant portion of their personnel. Turkish casualties were several times lower. Paralysis struck the headquarters of Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. No one could believe what had happened. The Russian army, accustomed to winning this war without much effort, had retreated before the Turks in an open field. Schilder Schuldner's report was read over and over again. It became obvious. The army's right flank was not just under threat. A deadly tumor had grown upon it, capable of severing the arteries of the entire offensive. The war, which was supposed to end by autumn, suddenly revealed its true, hideous face. The illusion of a quick stroll to the Balkans dissolved in the gunpowder smoke over the Grivitsa heights. After Schilder Schuldner's defeat, a pause descended on the front at Plevna, lasting about 10 days. These 10 days decided the outcome of the entire campaign for months to come. The Russian command spent this time trying to recover, bring up reserves, and appoint a new commander, General Krudner. Meanwhile, Osman Pasha spent this time transforming the soft hills of Plevna into one of the most terrifying defensive systems of that war. Osman Pasha had not studied in European academies where they taught the classical art of Vauban-style sieges with beautiful stone bastions and geometrically perfect ravelins. He was a practitioner of war. He understood that against rifled artillery, stone was merely a source of lethal shrapnel. Only one thing could protect the infantry: earth. By his order, the entire Turkish army, along with the inhabitants of Plevna, from the young to the old, took up shovels. Day and night, under the scorching July sun, they dug. Osman Pasha positioned his fortifications thoughtfully. He did not surround the town with a continuous wall. He built a system of independent but mutually supporting earthen redoubts on all the commanding heights near Grivitsa, Radyshevo, and the Green Hills. An Osman Pasha redoubt was not just a trench. It was an engineering marvel of its time. A deep ditch lay before a rampart, the earthen wall itself rising 2 to 3 meters high. On the crest of the rampart were sandbags with narrow loopholes left for shooting. Inside the redoubt were deep dugouts, roofed with logs and a layer of earth about 1 meter thick. In these dugouts, the infantry could wait out the fiercest artillery bombardment in relative safety. But the main innovation was the trench system. Trenches connected the redoubts to one another, forming several lines of defense. If the enemy captured the front trench, they immediately came under crossfire from the second and third lines, located slightly higher up the slope. The entire geometry of these fortifications was designed to leave not a single blind spot. Every patch of land in front of Plevna could be fired upon from at least 2 positions. Osman Pasha had created a system capable of grinding down attacking infantry, and soon this system would get the chance to prove itself in action. General Krudner, having received an order from the Grand Duke to put an end to Plevna, approached the town with an army of approximately 30,000 men and 170 guns. By this time, Osman Pasha had about 22,000 soldiers and 58 guns. The numerical advantage was on the side of the Russians. On July 18th, Old Style, 1877, Krudner gave the order to storm the town. Thus began the Second Battle of Plevna. The day turned out to be gloomy, humid, and unbearably hot. From the morning, the Russian artillery opened massive fire on the Turkish positions. Over 150 cannons pounded the earthen ramparts for several hours. The roar was monstrous. The earth shook. Through Russian binoculars, it seemed that nothing living could possibly remain in the Turkish positions. The hills boiled with explosions. The Russian generals watched the bombardment with satisfaction, confident that the cannons had done their job. But they were wrong. Osman Pasha's earthen ramparts largely absorbed the cast iron shells. The projectiles bogged down in the soft soil inflicting no serious harm on the infantry sheltering in the deep dugouts. The artillery preparation, which looked terrifying, proved to be far less effective than the Russian headquarters had calculated. At 3 p.m., the Russian infantry went on the attack. The main blow was delivered in the east against the Gravitsa redoubt, Osman Pasha's most powerful fortification. And once again, just like 10 days ago, the Russian regiments marched in closed columns, shoulder to shoulder, to the beating of drums. They marched across open cornfields that offered absolutely no cover. When the lines closed to a distance of 1,000 paces, the Turkish trenches, which had seemed completely lifeless, suddenly came alive. Osman Pasha's soldiers emerged from their dugouts, stepped up to the loopholes between the sandbags, and opened rapid fire from their Peabody Martini rifles. What happened next was described by participants as a descent into hell. A leaden storm slammed into the Russian columns. Whole rows of the advancing lines were mown down. Men fell before they could even comprehend where the death had come from. The fire was of such density that corn stalks were sheared off by bullets, as if by a sickle. The smoke from the black powder shrouded the lowlands in a thick, impenetrable fog, illuminated only by the orange flashes of gunfire. One of the Russian officers recalled, "We walked as if into a wall. Men fell to the right and left without making a sound. Death worked here continuously." Despite sustaining the heaviest of casualties, the Russian infantry, displaying immense stubbornness, continued to tear forward. Individual companies of the Penza and Tambov regiments reached the very ditch of the Gravitsa redoubt. They tried to scramble up the earthen ramparts, gripping the slippery clay with their bare hands, but they were shot at point-blank range or met with bayonets. On the southern flank, General Skobelev, a young, audacious commander who would soon become a legend, attempted to break through with his Cossacks and infantry, but he too was stopped by dense fire from the Radoshevo fortifications. The command of the Russian army largely lost control over the course of the battle. Communication between regiments broke down. Krudner, situated far in the rear, did not have a complete picture of the reality unfolding and kept sending new reserves into the fray. These reserves marched straight into the kill zone and suffered heavy losses within minutes. By evening, as the sun began to set, casting a crimson light over the battlefield, it became absolutely clear that the assault had failed. The signal to retreat was sounded, but the withdrawal had to be made under the same crossfire. Attempts were made to carry the wounded out by hand, but this cost even more lives. The field in front of the Gravitsa redoubt was strewn with bodies in green uniforms. The casualties of the Second Battle of Plevna plunged the Russian Empire into shock. About 7,300 Russian soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day. The Turks lost about 2,000 men. The ratio spoke for itself. Earthen fortification and the repeating rifle had permanently devalued ceremonial bayonet charges in closed formations. The era of Napoleonic linear tactics was living out its final months on the hills outside Plevna. A genuine panic erupted in the main headquarters of Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. The Grand Duke, a nervous and impressionable man, was crushed by what had happened. He imagined that Osman Pasha's army might burst out of Plevna, strike the rear, cut the crossings on the Danube, and throw the Russian troops into the river. For the first time in this war, the Russian army faced the very real threat of a massive, catastrophic rout on this sector of the front. In this atmosphere of despair, the Grand Duke took a step that was humiliating for the pride of the empire, but politically necessary. He appealed to the Romanian prince, Carol I. The meaning of the appeal was entirely direct. The situation is serious. An urgent crossing of Romanian troops is required, on whatever terms the Russian command would propose. Romania, which up until this moment had stayed out of direct, large-scale clashes, was waiting for exactly this. Carol agreed, receiving in return the position of nominal commander-in-chief of the combined Russian-Romanian forces at Plevna, although in practice the operations continued to be directed by Russian generals. The Romanian army, consisting of about 35,000 fresh, well-equipped soldiers, began to cross the river. Osman Pasha saw the ring tightening. He saw new corps approaching, but he did not attempt to flee or attack first. He kept digging. He knew the Russians would not rest. There would be a third assault, and he prepared to meet it in such a way that this assault would be the last major battle of this campaign beneath the walls of his fortress. By late August 1877, the hills around Plevna had transformed into one of the most discussed focal points of all European politics. Troops, supply trains, artillery and monarchs were converging on Plevna. Emperor Alexander II himself arrived at the main headquarters of the Russian army. The presence of the Tsar at the front is always a double-edged sword. On one hand, it inspires the soldiers. On the other hand, it turns a military operation into an event where defeat equals a devastating political blow to prestige, and a victory begs to be timed with a beautiful date. Such a date was chosen, August 30th, the name day of Emperor Alexander II. The capture of Plevna was supposed to be the greatest gift to the autocrat. The headquarters was confident that this time everything would work out. An armada, impressive for its time, was assembled at Plevna. The Russian-Romanian troops numbered about 100,000 bayonets and sabres. The artillery park was increased to over 400 guns. Standing against them was Osman Pasha, whose army, bolstered by reinforcements, had grown from 22,000 to approximately 34,000 men, with 72 cannons. A significant numerical superiority in manpower and a massive advantage in artillery. According to all the laws of military arithmetic, Plevna looked doomed. The plan of the commander-in-chief, Prince Karol, and his chief of staff, Russian General Zotov, relied on overwhelming firepower. They decided to conduct a 4-day artillery preparation. 4 days of continuous fire from over 400 barrels was supposed to flatten the Turkish redoubts and open a clear path for the infantry. On August 26th at 6 a.m., the first volley rang out. The earth trembled. Observers standing on the hills described the spectacle as a true hell. A solid dome of black gunpowder smoke and dust rose over Plevna, inside of which the yellow and red flashes of explosions flickered continuously. Cast iron shells tore the earth apart, digging massive craters and snapping trees. The roar was so intense that men could not hear each other, even when screaming directly into an ear. Artillerymen had their ears deafened by the constant cannonade. For 4 days, the Russian and Romanian batteries fired thousands of shells. Emperor Alexander II watched all of this from the height of a specially constructed wooden platform. High spirits reigned in the headquarters. It seemed impossible that a single person could survive in that utter inferno. But Osman Pasha survived. His army survived as well. The earthen fortifications he had been building throughout August proved their effectiveness against the smooth-bore and early rifled artillery of that era. The shells got bogged down in the thick earthen ramparts. The Turks sat deep in their dugouts, roofed with thick logs and a layer of soil, and waited. At night, when the shelling died down, they emerged to the surface with shovels and rapidly repaired the ruined parapets. By the morning of August 30th, the Turkish positions were almost as strong as they had been before the bombardment began. The Russian headquarters did not know this. The thick smoke made it impossible to assess the actual damage. Zotov and Karol were convinced that Plevna had been severely weakened. The morning of August 30th turned out to be abominable. A low, leaden sky, dense fog, and a cold, piercing rain. The Balkan loam instantly turned into a slippery slop. In such weather, gunpowder gets damp, boots slide apart, and visibility drops to a mere 100 paces. But no one dared to cancel the assault on the Emperor's name day. At 3 p.m., drums began to beat, and bugles began to sing across the entire front. Nearly 100,000 men rose from their trenches and went into the attack. The Third Battle of Plevna had begun. The Romanian troops attacked in the northeast. Their target was the first Grivița redoubt, the most powerful node of defense, which the Russians had unsuccessfully stormed in July. The Romanians, whom Russian officers had previously treated with some condescension, considering them an inexperienced army, displayed exceptional resilience that day. They marched up the slippery, muddy slope, bogging down in the mire under a squall of fire from the Peabody Martini rifles. The Turks fired point blank. The Romanian lines fell one after another. When standard bearers fell, the banners were caught by others who pressed on. They reached the ditch. The ditch was filled with rainwater and mud mixed with blood. Soldiers jumped into this sludge, scrambled up the rampart, slipped, fell under the blows of bayonets and rifle butts, but climbed back up again. At the cost of horrific casualties, the Romanians, joined by Russian battalions, broke into the redoubt and drove the Turks out. But it turned out that behind the first Grivița redoubt stood a second one, of which reconnaissance had been completely unaware. Murderous fire was immediately opened from it, the offensive in the north drowned in blood. In the center, the Russian infantry attempted to take the Omar Bey and Radishevo redoubts. The scenario of the Second Battle of Plevna repeated itself with frightening accuracy. Columns became bogged down in the cornfields, artillery support lagged behind, the cannons sinking into the mud. The infantry found themselves one-on-one with a wall of lead. In a matter of hours, the central grouping lost thousands of men, killed and wounded, and rolled back to its starting positions in total disarray. But the most dramatic, bloodiest, and most awe-inspiring events of that day unfolded on the southern flank. There, the detachment of General Mikhail Dmitrievich Skobelev was advancing. Skobelev was a phenomenon. At just 33 years old, he was already a major general, renowned for his campaigns in Turkestan. Tall, with a thick beard, he always rode onto the battlefield on a white horse, wearing a white uniform. This was not mere posturing. Skobelev explained it plainly. He did not want his soldiers to think he was hiding. And if he were to be killed, let everyone see how a Russian general dies. His soldiers idolized him. In the army he was known as the White General. But beneath this outward theatricality hid one of the most advanced tactical minds of that war. Skobelev understood what the headquarters did not. He saw that dense columns marching against repeating rifles meant massive and largely useless casualties. He attacked differently. His detachment advanced in short dashes, in open skirmish order, utilizing the folds of the terrain. The infantry moved in waves. The first wave would drop down and open return fire. The second wave would sprint past them, pushing forward. Skobelev's objective was the Green Hills, a chain of heights south of Plevna, upon which stood the redoubts of Isa Aga and Kavanlak. Skobelev personally led his battalions. His white uniform flashed in the very inferno of the battle. On that day, 2 horses were killed under him. He walked ahead of his lines, waving his drawn blade, encouraging his soldiers, and his men accomplished the nearly impossible. They broke through the dense fire, crossed a deep ravine, shattered the Turkish defense, and, riding on the shoulders of the retreating enemy, burst into the redoubts. By the evening of August 30th, Skobelev's detachment had captured the southern fortifications. Plevna lay before them almost in the palm of their hand. Only a few hundred meters remained to the town. The Turkish defense in the south had been breached, but Osman Pasha, located in the center of the town, instantly assessed the threat. The loss of the southern redoubts meant the fall of Plevna. He pulled reserves from the sectors where the Russian attacks had already bogged down and hurled them against Skobelev. Large Turkish forces began to close in around the small Russian bridgehead on the Green Hills. Skobelev found himself in a highly perilous position. The Turks counterattacked wave after wave. The Russians fought back with bayonets and rifle butts, scavenging cartridges from fallen enemies. Skobelev dispatched one messenger after another to the main headquarters, begging for reserves, assuring them that the road to Plevna was wide open and that all it would take was one fresh regiment to seize the town. Meanwhile, in the headquarters, where the commander-in-chief Karol, General Zotov, and the emperor himself were present, an atmosphere of profound gloom prevailed. Reports from other sectors of the front were utterly depressing. The center had retreated with massive casualties. The Romanians were bleeding out in the single captured redoubt. The command hesitated. When Skobelev's messenger arrived pleading for reinforcements, Zotov refused. Fresh regiments were stationed not far away, but the headquarters did not dare risk them, believing that Skobelev's success could not be expanded given the overall disastrous situation of the day. The White General was left practically without support. The night from August 30th to August 31st became a horrific ordeal for Skobelev's detachment. They held their defense in the captured redoubts among the bodies of the dead. Freezing rain drizzled relentlessly. On the morning of August 31st, Osman Pasha launched a decisive assault on the Green Hills. The Turks went on the attack several times in a row. Each time, the Russian soldiers, whose ammunition was almost entirely depleted, threw them back in hand-to-hand combat. By the middle of the day on August 31st, barely half of Skobelev's detachment remained. Men were collapsing from sheer exhaustion. Realizing that no help was coming, and that a new Turkish attack would obliterate the remnants of his unit, Skobelev gave the order to retreat. The withdrawal was covered by the remnants of the Vladimirsky and Suzdalski regiments. They retreated step by step, firing back with their last bullets. Skobelev himself was one of the last to leave. Eyewitnesses recalled that when he returned to the Russian camp, he was almost unrecognizable. His face was blackened with soot and fatigue. His white uniform was so thoroughly soaked with the blood of the wounded soldiers he had carried out on his own back that it had turned crimson. According to some accounts, he tore off his medal and threw it to the ground in utter despair. The victory that had been practically in his hands had turned into a bitter disappointment due to the indecisiveness of the headquarters. The Third Battle of Plevna had ended. What was supposed to be a name-day gift for the emperor turned into one of the bloodiest chapters of this war. Allied casualties were staggering. The Russian army lost about 13,000 men killed and wounded. The Romanian army, about 3,000. Nearly 16,000 soldiers were left lying in the clay before the earthen redoubts. Osman Pasha's losses were estimated at 3,000 to 4,000 men. A heavy silence hung over the main headquarters. Emperor Alexander II, traumatized by what he had seen, was in a state of profound depression. On the evening of September 1st, a military council was convened. The atmosphere was grim. Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich, having lost all presence of mind, proposed lifting the siege of Plevna, retreating across the Danube into Romania and waiting there for spring, effectively acknowledging the campaign of 1877 as a failure. This would mean a massive political blow to Russia's prestige. Minister of War Miliutin, who was also at the headquarters, vehemently opposed this decision. He declared that a retreat would demoralize the army and trigger severe political upheaval within the country. "We cannot leave," he said. "We must take Plevna, and if we cannot take it by force, we must take it by calculation." The Tsar supported Miliutin. It was decided to stay, but the primary question remained: how to take these earthen ramparts against which 3 assaults and tens of thousands of lives had been smashed. And then Miliutin named the man who was meant to save the situation for the Russian army. A man who was at that moment in Petersburg, somewhat in the shadows, because many considered his methods outdated. That man was Eduard Ivanovich Totleben, a fortification engineer of immense experience. The very same Totleben who, 22 years earlier during the Crimean War, using earthen fortifications, had held Sevastopol for almost a year against the combined armies of Britain, France, and Turkey. The telegram was sent to Petersburg immediately. Totleben packed his bags the very same day. Totleben's arrival at Plevna in late September changed everything. A 59-year-old general with bushy sideburns and spectacles, calm and methodical, he did not call for new attacks. He rode around the positions, looked through his spyglass at the Turkish redoubts, evaluated the depth of the ditches and the fields of fire, and uttered a phrase that effectively became a death sentence for Osman Pasha's future fate. "There will be no fourth assault," he told the Grand Duke. "We will not take Plevna by storm. That would cost another tens of thousands of soldiers. But we will ensure that Osman Pasha himself is forced to seek a way out." Totleben understood the nature of Plevna's defence far better than those who had spilled rivers of blood before it. He understood that Osman Pasha had created a near-perfect field fortress, and such a fortress cannot be breached by a frontal assault. It had to be taken by starvation. A new, the longest, and in its own way the cruelest phase of the war began. A phase that transformed the confrontation from a series of open attacks into a methodical siege, largely foreshadowing the trench warfare horrors of the coming century. The blockade. Totleben's Plevna noose began to tighten. He changed the very logic of the campaign. The first thing he ordered was the cessation of all senseless local attacks and skirmishes. The Russian army, which up to this point had been trying to break through the defense with frontal blows, now began to transform itself into a siege ring. Along the entire perimeter, spanning dozens of kilometers around Plevna, axes began to chop and shovels began to scrape. The Russian troops built their own earthen redoubts, dug full-profile trenches, and equipped artillery batteries. Totleben encircled Plevna in a tight ring of fortifications. He built the infrastructure of the blockade, laid roads for the transport of ammunition, organized hospitals, and ordered the construction of warm dugouts for the soldiers because he knew winter was coming. But there was one problem, without the resolution of which this entire blockade lost its meaning. The ring around Plevna was not fully closed. To the west, behind Osman Pasha's back, the Sofia Road remained open. Along this corridor, supply wagons carrying food, ammunition, and medicine regularly trailed from Sofia to Plevna, while the wounded were evacuated in the opposite direction. This route was protected by a chain of fortified Turkish points, Gornji Dubnik, Telish, and Dolnji Dubnik. As long as this artery functioned, Osman Pasha could hold out for a very long time. Totleben pointed to the map. "Cut this road, and Plevna will begin to die on its own." The task of closing the ring was entrusted to General Josef Gurko, the same Gurko who had taken Shipka in a rapid march back in July. He was a commander of exceptional energy, for whom the word impossible barely existed in his vocabulary. But the strength of the infantry regiment, bled dry by 3 assaults, was insufficient for this operation. And then an event occurred that altered the composition of this war. In October, the Russian Imperial Guard arrived in the Balkans from Petersburg. These were the Preobrazhensky, Semyonovsky, Izmailovsky, Pavlovsky, Yegersky, and Finlyansky regiments, the elite units of the empire. Soldiers selected, among other things, for their physical stature, officers who were representatives of famous aristocratic families, for many of whom this was their first real combat experience. They went to war still largely holding pre-war, romanticized notions of what this service would be like. The Balkan mud and the fire of repeating rifles quickly aligned these notions with the grim reality faced by the rest of the army. On October 24, 1877, Gurko led the guard against Gornji Dubnik, the key fortified Turkish position on the Sofia highway. Gornji Dubnik consisted of two massive redoubts, the large and the small, surrounded by deep ditches and connected by trenches. The garrison, under the command of Ahmed Hifsi Pasha, numbered about 4,000 men with 4 cannons. The Turks, just as at Plevna, had dug deep into the earth. In the morning, the Russian artillery began its bombardment, but, as during the assaults on Plevna, the effectiveness of fire against earthen fortifications proved very low. At 10 a.m., Gurko gave the order to advance. Regiments with long military histories went into battle. The Izmailovsky, Pavlovsky, Moskovsky, and Grenadier units moved forward. The guardsmen marched in a fairly tight formation, maintaining their alignment. Their officers walked ahead with drawn sabers, and the Turkish trenches once again unleashed a squall of fire. Repeating rifles mowed down the guard lines. Soldiers tumbled into the Balkan mud. Casualties were severe. The Pavlovsky regiment suffered particularly heavily. The small redoubt was taken relatively quickly, albeit at great cost, but the large redoubt held firm, and the attack stalled. The Russian lines hit the dirt 100 paces from the Turkish trenches, seeking cover in the folds of the terrain, unable to rise up or rapidly retreat. The day was leaning toward evening. The situation seemed critical. The alarming scenario of the previous Plevna assaults was repeating itself. Gurko realized that another frontal assault would cost far too dearly. And then something happened that demonstrated the difference between formal discipline and a genuine will to win. The Russian guardsmen, pinned down by fire dozens of meters from the redoubt, began, without any general command from above, crawling on their bellies, 1 or 2 at a time, creeping right up to the edge of the ditch. Officers and soldiers, plastered in mud, gradually accumulated in the dead zone directly beneath the Turkish parapet, where the Turks could not shoot at them without risking exposing themselves from cover. At dusk, when visibility dropped, these disorganized groups, huddled in the ditch, suddenly leaped over the parapet with a roar of hurrah. No formations, no parade step. It was a desperate, spontaneous, hand-to-hand brawl in the dark. Bayonets, rifle butts, fists. The guardsmen, whose pristine uniforms had long turned to rags, fought with the fury of men avenging their fallen comrades. At 6 p.m., the large redoubt of Gornji Dubnik fell. Ahmed Hifsi Pasha and the surviving Turkish soldiers surrendered as prisoners, but the price paid by the Guard for this first serious combat experience was exorbitant. In the battles at Gornji Dubnik, the Russian troops lost over 3,300 men killed and wounded, a massive portion of which fell upon the Guard regiments. More than 100 officers were killed or injured. Many families in Petersburg received tragic news in those days. The notion of war as a predominantly chivalrous parade ground affair rapidly dissipated along with that news. 4 days later, on October 28th, the neighbouring fortified point of Telish fell. Its garrison surrendered after a massive artillery bombardment, terrified by the news of Gornji Dubnik's fate, and having lost all hope of being relieved. The Sofia highway was severed. The last major artery connecting Osman Pasha to the outside world was cut. Totleben's Plevna noose snapped shut. A ring approximately 40 kilometers in diameter, encompassing around 100,000 Russian-Romanian soldiers, completely enclosed the Turkish army and the civilian population of Plevna. November arrived, and with November came an enemy to the Balkans that did not distinguish between the colors of uniforms. Winter arrived. A Balkan winter with icy winds, freezing rains turning into sleet, and nightly frosts. The situation inside Plevna began to deteriorate rapidly. Osman Pasha, completely isolated, became a hostage to his own successful defense. His earthen fortress saved them from artillery shells, but it could not provide bread. Tens of thousands of civilian refugees, mostly Muslims from surrounding villages, and a massive army had accumulated in the town. Food supplies melted away at a terrifying speed. First, the Turkish command cut the soldiers' rations in half, then even more. Civilians were given practically nothing. People began to eat horses. When the horses necessary for hauling artillery were placed under strict inventory, donkeys, dogs, and cats were consumed. By mid-November, there were almost no stray animals left in Plevna. Soldiers boiled leather belts and made stews from straw and acorns. Worse than the hunger was the cold. There was almost no firewood left in the town. The defenders dismantled fences for fuel, chopped down trees in orchards, used wooden outbuildings, carts, and even the stocks of broken rifles for firewood. But this was nowhere near enough to warm tens of thousands of soldiers sitting in frozen earthen trenches. Yet the most horrific ordeal to hit Plevna was disease. Overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, a lack of clean water, and the severe physical exhaustion of the populace led to an outbreak of epidemics. Typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia scythed through the Turkish garrison just as effectively as Russian artillery shells. Plevna lacked medicine, bandages, and doctors. The wounded lay in unheated mosques and barns in atrocious conditions. The mortality rate soared. Corpses could not be buried properly in time. They were piled into shallow ditches or simply left on the outskirts of the town. Despite this absolute nightmare, discipline within Osman Pasha's army remained generally solid. He was a man of colossal willpower. He walked the trenches daily, maintained the soldiers' morale, and categorically refused to discuss capitulation. According to the accounts of contemporaries, he repeatedly told his officers that surrendering the fortress without an explicit order from the Sultan was unthinkable, as long as the army was capable of holding weapons. Outside, in the Russian ring, conditions were also far from ideal. Russian soldiers froze in their dugouts, fell ill, and suffered from poor supply logistics, as the quartermaster service operated with significant interruptions. But they had a much more reliable supply of provisions. They had winter sheepskin coats, firewood, and, most importantly, they had hope. They knew that time was working in their favor. Every day of the blockade brought the resolution at Plevna closer. Totleben, methodical and relentless, continued to tighten the ring. Artillery periodically harassed the Turks with bombardments, denying them the chance to peacefully recover their strength. Russian sappers slowly, trench by trench, crept closer to the Turkish redoubts, preparing, if necessary, for mine warfare. In November, Commander-in-Chief Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich sent Osman Pasha an offer of honorable capitulation, guaranteeing their lives and respectful treatment of the prisoners. Osman Pasha's reply went down in the history of military diplomacy of that war. It was polite but utterly resolute. Osman Pasha thanked him for his concern regarding his soldiers, but stated that military duty and the Sultan's orders did not allow him to lay down his arms while his army was still capable of fighting. The siege continued. By late November, the situation in Plevna had become unequivocally critical. Only a few days' worth of provisions remained. Ammunition for the artillery was almost entirely exhausted. Mortality from disease and starvation remained exceptionally high. Osman Pasha convened a military council. Before him sat exhausted generals who had aged years during the months of the siege. The choice was agonizing. The first option, capitulate while the men were still capable of standing on their feet. The second, wait a bit longer, risking that the town would fall without any resistance whatsoever due to starvation. The third, attempt to break through the Russian blockade ring, reach the Sofia road, and save at least a part of the army. breaking through a ring consisting of 100,000 comparatively well-supplied soldiers backed by hundreds of cannons, using a force of emaciated, freezing men with limited ammunition, was an incredibly risky enterprise. It was, in many ways, an act of sheer desperation, but remaining in place meant condemning the army to a slow death without firing a single shot. Osman Pasha chose the breakout. He had no intention of surrendering Plevna for nothing. In the strictest secrecy, the Turks began preparations. The date was set for November 28th, old style. Osman Pasha decided to strike westward across the river Vid in the direction of Vidin. He intended to smash through the Russian defense on a narrow sector and burst out into the operational open space. On the night before the breakout, something heavy and somber was taking place in Plevna. The soldiers received their last ration, scraps of hardtack. Civilian Muslims who wished to leave with the army were permitted to pack their belongings into carts. Artillerymen spiked and abandoned the heavy cannons in the town, as it was impossible to drag them through the snow. The wounded were carried out of the mosques and loaded onto creaking arbors, carts. The town emptied out. Tens of thousands of people, under the cover of darkness and heavily falling snow, began to stealthily descend toward the river Vid. The people walked in total silence. The wheels of the carts were wrapped in rags to muffle the clatter. The horses had their muzzles tied shut so they would not neigh. Everyone understood. Not everyone would survive the coming day. The final act of the Plevna tragedy was beginning. The battle on the river Vid. The night of November 27th to 28th, 1877, was pitch black, dead quiet, and freezing. The sky was covered by heavy, low clouds that incessantly dumped wet snow, which instantly turned into a crust of ice on the soldiers' greatcoats. In this absolute darkness, Plevna commenced its final movement. Tens of thousands of men, emaciated, starving, wrapped in rags, soundlessly descended from the hills to the river Vid. Behind them creaked the carts carrying the wounded, those sick with typhus, and civilian refugees. Women clutched their children tightly, desperately trying to keep them from crying and breaking the silence. The soldiers marched, gripping their rifles in numb hands, knowing that they had only a few dozen cartridges left in their ammo pouches. Osman Pasha planned to strike on a narrow sector of the front, breach the Russian blockade line on the left bank of the river Vid, access the Sofia highway, and escape into the mountains. Guarding this very sector was the Grenadier Corps of General Ivan Ganetsky, sturdy, battle-tested units that, however, did not expect a full-scale breakout by the entire Turkish army in this specific place and in such horrendous weather. Turkish sappers, working in icy water, hastily constructed additional pontoon bridges. By dawn, a significant portion of the Ottoman army had crossed to the left bank. At 7 a.m. on November 28th, the fog over the river Vid was so dense that visibility did not exceed 20 paces. Russian patrols from the Sibirsky Grenadier Regiment heard a growing rumble only when the Ottoman lines had closed to almost point-blank range. A battle cry erupted from the fog, and a furious strike crashed into the Russian trenches. This was not a tactically calculated attack. It was the onslaught of men who had absolutely nothing left to lose. The Turks did not shoot from afar, saving their ammunition. They threw themselves into hand-to-hand combat right into the Russian trenches. Starving, exhausted men fought with such ferocity that the stout Russian grenadiers were momentarily stunned. Bayonets, rifle butts, and knives were put to use. The Sibirsky Regiment, having absorbed the initial blow, was pushed back. Behind them, the Malorossiyski Grenadier Regiment also began to retreat. Osman Pasha, right in the thick of his advancing troops, saw the Russian line tearing open. The The Turkish battalions captured the first line of trenches, then the second. They overran the artillery batteries, capturing several Russian cannons. It seemed a breakout was actually possible. The Turkish soldiers, seeing a gap in the Russian defenses, were suddenly emboldened. But miracles in such a war do not last long. General Ganetsky, hearing the roar of battle on his sector, immediately threw his reserves into the breach. The Astrakhansky and Samogitsky grenadier regiments stepped up to meet the surging Turks. The Russian artillery on the flanks, getting their bearings in the fog, opened fire on the sides of the advancing enemy. Two massive waves of humanity collided in the narrow space between the river and the Russian positions. A meeting engagement of immense density began. Gunpowder smoke mingled with the fog, turning the battlefield into a murky twilight. Controlling battalions in this chaos was practically impossible. The battle disintegrated into a multitude of separate, savage skirmishes. Osman Pasha realized that the momentum of the assault was fading. Russian reserves were arriving one after another, and the ring was violently hurling the Turks back. The Pasha attempted to personally lead a new attack, sitting on horseback surrounded by his staff officers. And at that exact moment, a Russian artillery shell exploded nearby. Shrapnel killed the horse beneath Osman Pasha and severely wounded the commander himself in the leg. The Pasha tumbled into the snow. Officers rushed to him, picked him up, and carried him to a medical wagon. In any army, the wounding of a commander causes turmoil. In the Turkish army, which largely held together on faith in the absolute resilience of its commander-in-chief, the news of his wounding was a devastating blow to morale. A rumor swept through the lines that the Pasha had been mortally wounded or killed. In that very minute, the troops who had just been fighting with immense stubbornness began to fall back toward the river Vid, toward the bridges. But sheer horror was unfolding on the bridges. Hearing the roar of battle and the screams of the retreating men, the civilian refugees on the carts panicked and rushed the crossings. The narrow pontoon and wooden bridges instantly became choked with wagons, livestock, and the wounded. The retreating Turkish infantry slammed into this crush of bodies. People crushed one another. The Russian artillery, finally acquiring a solid target, began pounding the bridges. Shells blew wagons to pieces and hurled people into the icy water. Many drowned in the panicked stampede. In some sections, the river Vid was utterly choked with the wreckage of carts. Osman Pasha, lying in a wagon that his officers had barely managed to guide through this mob to a small building near the bridge, heard these screams. The man who for months had held off the onslaught of two armies and constructed one of the most effective field fortresses of his time was now watching the death throes of his own troops. He was weakened by blood loss. He understood that any further resistance would only lead to new, utterly senseless slaughter among those who were still alive. Osman Pasha gave the order to cease resistance and raise the white flag. Above the structure, near the bridge, a white flag tied to a bayonet fluttered in the air. Then white flags began to rise above the remnants of the Turkish positions. Russian buglers blew the ceasefire signal. The shooting gradually died down until a tense silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded, hung over the valley of the river Vid. The commander of the Russian grenadiers, General Ganetsky, rode up to the temporary shelter near the bridge, and soon General Skobelev arrived as well. The very same Skobelev who had so recently lost countless soldiers on the southern redoubts, storming Osman's fortifications. The meeting between the victors and the vanquished was completely devoid of malice. According to numerous accounts, Skobelev, addressing the wounded Turkish commander, paid profound respect to his months-long defense, calling it one of the most significant feats of military art in that entire war. The following day, Osman Pasha was delivered to the main headquarters of the Russian army. There, he was met by Emperor Alexander II, and Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich. Russian troops, lined up in a guard of honor, rendered the highest military salutes to their former adversary. They knew the price of the blood spilled beneath those hills far too well not to deeply respect the man who had forced them to pay it. According to available records, Alexander II ordered that Osman Pasha be allowed to keep his personal sidearm as a mark of immense respect for the courage he had displayed. It was a gesture entirely in the spirit of 19th century notions of martial honor between monarchs and generals. But this ceremonial side of the affair masked a much grimmer reality, one not usually detailed in parade ground historical texts. The reality of what happened not to the commanders, but to the ordinary Turkish prisoners of war. Along with Osman Pasha, an estimated 34,000 to 36,000 Turkish soldiers capitulated, those directly involved in the breakout, as well as a massive number of civilian refugees, wounded men, and rear echelon personnel who had remained in the town itself and had not attempted the breakout. Including all these categories, the total number of people who surrendered at Plevna is cited by sources at up to 43,000. Exhausted by starvation, sick with typhus and frostbitten, they represented not so much an army as a colossal open-air hospital. The Russian quartermaster service, which was barely managing to supply its own troops, was utterly unprepared for such an overwhelming number of prisoners all at once. There was almost nothing to feed them, and practically no one to treat them. The prisoners were divided into columns and marched on foot across the snow-covered Balkans, across the Danube, toward Romania and the inner provinces of Russia. It was a brutally devastating march. The ragged Turks walked through deep snow, many still wearing their summer uniforms, entirely lacking warm clothing. The convoy guards had no orders to harm them, but the frost, starvation, and typhus did the job no less effectively than bullets. Men collapsed on the shoulders of the roads and simply remained there. A tragic trail of those who could not survive the trek stretched endlessly behind the columns. Local residents, whose own bitter memories of this war were still fresh, were far from always willing to share food and water with the prisoners. According to various estimates, a significant portion of those who surrendered at Plevna did not survive the subsequent march and the horrific conditions of captivity during the winter. Such was the true price of this war. Official honors remained the exclusive domain of commanders. For the ordinary soldier of any warring side, this war too often ended in typhus, frostbite, and an unmarked grave on the side of a foreign road. But strategically, the fall of Plevna meant one thing. The defensive line of the Ottoman Empire on this axis had been completely broken. The Russian army, which had pinned about 100,000 bayonets around the town, was suddenly free for further action. The road beyond the Balkans, to Sofia, Adrianople, and onward to Constantinople, was laid wide open. In the headquarters of Alexander II, preparations began for a winter offensive that was meant to end the war entirely. December 1877. Plevna had fallen. Osman Pasha's army ceased to exist as an organized military force. In the headquarters of the European powers, in London, Vienna, and Berlin, many reasoned according to the laws of standard military logic. A harsh winter had set in. The passes of the Balkan mountains were buried in snow. Temperatures had plummeted well below freezing. It was widely assumed that the war must halt until spring, because no regular army of that era would ever risk advancing through icy mountains in the dead of winter. Europe calculated that it had a few months to use diplomatic efforts to tie Russia's hands and prevent it from completely crushing the Ottoman Empire. These calculations failed to account for one factor. After 5 months of agonizingly brutal battles at Plevna, the Russian army felt a determination to see the job through that no frost could ever cool. Alexander II made the decision not to halt the offensive. Immediately, without waiting for spring, They were to cross the Balkan Ridge and strike deep into Turkish territory. It was a decision balancing on the absolute edge of reasonable risk. General Gurko, who was tasked with leading a massive detachment across the Arabakonak Pass to Sofia, gathered his officers and explained the impending horrors without any sugarcoating, emphasizing that the order must be fulfilled regardless of the cost. The winter crossing of the Balkans began. What transpired on those icy mountain trails in December 1877 was a true confrontation, not so much with the Turks as with the mercilessness of nature itself. Soldiers marched along narrow ledges above bottomless gorges. Blizzards buried the paths so deeply that the columns moved almost entirely blind. The artillery, without which descending to the plains was utterly meaningless, had to be hauled by hand in many places. Horses slipped and tumbled from the icy trails. Then the soldiers themselves harnessed up to the heavy guns. They wrapped the wheels in straw and rags. They chopped the ice with axes to carve out even the slightest footholds. They slept directly in the snow, huddled together in large groups, just to conserve body heat. At the Shipka Pass, where General Radetzky had held the defense for all those months, something very similar was taking place. The moment Plevna fell, Radetzky's troops shifted from their months-long defensive stand into a full offensive. The columns of Generals Skobelev and Sviatopolk-Mirsky moved to outflank the Turkish positions through the mountains. The snow reached the men's chests. They marched forward, literally packing the snow down with their own bodies. And this tremendous sacrifice justified itself. The appearance of Russian troops on the southern slopes of the Balkans struck the Turkish command like a sudden physical blow. The Turks stationed on the plain had genuinely believed the mountains would reliably protect them until spring. When exhausted but battle-ready Russian battalions began emerging from the blinding white squall, the Turkish defense on this vector rapidly crumbled. On January 4th, 1878, Sofia fell without any serious resistance. General Gurko rode into the city, which the Turkish administration had controlled for centuries. A few days later, near the village of Shainovo, south of Shipka, Skobelev and Sviatopolk-Mirsky caught the massive army of Vesil Pasha in a pincer movement and forced it to capitulate. Organized Turkish resistance in the Balkans effectively ceased to exist. A lightning-fast drive southward commenced. The Russian army, completely forgetting about its fatigue and frostbitten feet, raced across the Thracian plain at incredible speed. Turkish garrisons frequently abandoned fortresses without a fight. On January 20th, Adrianople, one of the most vital cities in the European part of the Ottoman Empire, fell. It was now merely a short distance to Constantinople. Panic reigned in the Ottoman capital. Sultan Abdul Hamid II, realizing just how dangerously close the Russian army had come, desperately began seeking avenues for an immediate peace. Russian forward cavalry patrols could clearly see the outlines of Constantinople's domes and the waters of the Sea of Marmara in the distance. And right at this exact moment, when the Russian regiments were standing in the immediate vicinity of Constantinople, grand European politics intervened. Britain, for whom Russia's access to the straits represented a dire geopolitical threat, simply could not stand aside. The British government dispatched a portion of its fleet into the Sea of Marmara, visibly demonstrating its readiness to intervene forcefully if Russian troops entered the Turkish capital. Austria-Hungary, alarmed by Russia's strengthening grip on the Balkans, was also exhibiting growing anxiety. Alexander II found himself facing an agonizing choice. The army stood on the very threshold of the greatest military triumph imaginable. But the country's economy was totally exhausted by the long campaign and the grueling winter marches. Going to war against a coalition of Britain and Austria-Hungary at that moment was something Russia was simply not prepared to do. The emperor made the decision to halt the advance without entering the city. Peace negotiations began in San Stefano, today a neighborhood in Istanbul. On March 3, 1878, New Style, the Treaty of San Stefano was signed. Under its terms, the map of the Balkans was radically altered. Serbia, Montenegro, and Romania received full recognized independence. The crowning achievement of the treaty was the creation of a vast autonomous Bulgaria with extensive territory, which included a large portion of Macedonia. For the Bulgarian people, this was the realization of a centuries-old dream to restore their own statehood, for which the Russian army had paid with unimaginable sacrifices at Plevna and Shipka. It seemed that absolute justice had triumphed. But this result proved heartbreakingly short-lived. The European powers expressed fierce dissatisfaction. The creation of a large, Petersburg-oriented Bulgaria in the Balkans meant a massive expansion of Russian influence in the region. London and Vienna forcefully demanded a revision of the Treaty of San Stefano. Russia, desperately striving to avoid a new massive war, agreed to an international congress. In the summer of 1878, the Congress of Berlin took place, chaired by the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. It largely tore apart and rewrote the terms that had been achieved on the battlefield. British and Austrian diplomats systematically sliced away what had been conquered at the cost of so many lives. The territory of Bulgaria was drastically reduced. It was stripped of its access to the Aegean Sea. Macedonia was handed back under Turkish administration, which would later become a primary source of new Balkan conflicts well into the 20th century. The southern part of Bulgaria remained an autonomous province within Turkey. Austria-Hungary, which had not even participated in military actions against the Ottoman Empire on this front, received the right to occupy Bosnia and Herzegovina, an act that decades later would have spectacularly far-reaching, catastrophic consequences for all of European politics. Russian diplomacy, crushed under the weight of circumstances, made concession after concession. The head of the Russian delegation, Chancellor Alexander Gorchakov, later evaluated the results of the Congress as one of the darkest and heaviest moments of his entire career. When the news of the Berlin Congress's decisions reached the Russian army, a heavy, oppressive mood settled over the regiments. Many men could not fathom it. They had waded through the nightmarish battles at Plevna. They had endured typhus in overflowing field hospitals. They had let their feet freeze on the high Balkan passes. They had marched to the very walls of the Turkish capital and annihilated a massive portion of the enemy forces. And now, diplomats in Berlin were reversing these hard-won conquests in favor of the Turks and handing out territorial gifts to other powers. This profound sense that military victory had been heavily devalued by diplomacy left a deep, enduring scar on Russian society. The sentiment, which could be summarized as, "We won the war, but failed to truly win the peace," became a central theme of post-war discourse. A growing resentment toward the weakness of their negotiating position festered in the army, which would subsequently become one of the factors fueling the rise of radical political moods. Yet historical processes possess their own undeniable inertia, which cannot be halted simply by signatures on a piece of paper. Despite the territorial amputations in Berlin, Bulgaria survived as a nation-state. Its core was preserved, and it was saved not so much by the decisions of diplomats as by the blood and sweat of Russian and Romanian troops in the redoubts of Grivitsa, at Gorny Dubnik, on Shipka, and in countless other places during this war. In the decades that followed, Bulgarians would relentlessly continue to strengthen and unify their statehood, and at the absolute center of this lengthy, difficult, and profoundly significant process, Plevna would remain forever. So, what exactly is Plevna in a broader historical context? Why does this name still hold such a prominent place among those who professionally study the military science and politics of the 19th century? Plevna largely became the exact transitional moment between two fundamentally different eras of warfare. Up until July 1877, the military thought of many European armies still relied heavily on the experience of the Napoleonic Wars. Closed formations, decisive bayonet charges, and advancing in dense columns with unfurled banners were still highly prized. Osman Pasha, through his system of earthen fortifications and the mass deployment of the rapid-firing Peabody Martini rifle, graphically demonstrated that a man sheltered in a well-prepared trench and armed with repeating weaponry is capable of inflicting horrific casualties on a vastly numerically superior enemy. Plevna became one of the most glaring omens of the positional warfare of the future. Watching the Russian regiments suffer catastrophic losses at the earthen redoubts of Grivitsa and the Green Hills, military theorists across various nations meticulously studied what had occurred. Over the following decades, armies gradually transitioned from brightly colored uniforms to protective, camouflaged gear. Infantry tactics evolved, and the importance of field fortification, heavy artillery, and combat engineering skyrocketed. The horrific realities that the world would fully witness decades later in World War I were largely foreshadowed and first thoroughly tested precisely on the gentle hills of Plevna. The siege of Plevna also served as a brutally severe academy for the Russian officer corps. Commanders who passed through the fires of these battles learned firsthand the deadly price of inadequate reconnaissance, hasty decisions, and poor coordination between units. The name of Mikhail Skobelev became permanently linked with a more flexible, highly maneuverable style of combat tactics. Eduard Totleben, by his own brilliant example, proved that meticulous engineering calculations and a methodical blockade can resolve the outcome of a confrontation far more reliably than a string of suicidal frontal assaults. And what remains in the memory of the peoples who lived through these events? In the modern Bulgarian city of Pleven, on the very hills where the described events unfolded, there is today a park named in honor of General Skobelev. Trees grow peacefully here, and people take walks. In the center of the park stands the Pleven Panorama, a massive building inside of which the sprawling canvas of the events of August 30th, 1877, the day of the third assault, is recreated. Bulgarians treat this memory with deep care. The redoubts, mass graves, and monuments have been meticulously preserved. In the center of Sofia stands a monument to the Russian Emperor Alexander II, known reverently in Bulgaria as the Tsar Liberator. This memory endures regardless of the shifting of political eras. In Moscow, in Ilyinsky Square, stands the monument chapel to the grenadiers who fell at Plevna. It is a restrained, solemn monument. The funds for its construction were collected, among others, by the veterans of the Grenadier Corps themselves. On its facets, the grim numbers of casualties and the names of the regiments are deeply carved. Today, thousands of Muscovites walk past this monument every single day, often without lingering their gaze on the inscriptions darkened by time. This is the natural flow of time. History eventually blends into the urban landscape. But if one pauses at this monument and remembers how tens of thousands of emaciated men soundlessly marched through the wet snow toward the pontoon bridges, and how they were met by Russian soldiers equally exhausted by months of savage combat, one vital truth about the nature of history becomes much clearer. States and nations are forged not only at negotiating tables where treaties are smoothly signed, they are forged, crucially, in the freezing mud, in frozen trenches, in cornfields under devastating crossfire. They are formed by the raw decisions of concrete human beings who, faced with the choice between retreating or continuing the fight, chose to take a step forward. Osman Pasha, who engineered one of the most effective field defensive systems of his era. Totleben, who managed to methodically crush that defense with an iron ring of blockade. Skobelev, who lost so many of his men on the southern redoubts, and the thousands upon thousands of ordinary participants in these events, all of them contributed to the final outcome of this campaign, leaving behind a legacy of experience that military historians scrutinize to this very day. The physical Plevna of 1877 has long since changed. The earth has naturally leveled the trenches over time. The river Vid flows calmly, showing no outward reminders of those deeply dramatic days. But as long as the concepts of duty, resilience, and the terrible price paid for major political decisions remain in our historical memory, this story will continue to captivate those who wish to hear it. The echoes of the events at Plevna rang out not only in the cast iron of Moscow monuments, and not only at diplomatic summits in Europe. They also profoundly affected Russian society, its internal structure, and the fates of those who returned from those hills alive. The story of Plevna would be incomplete if we ignored what transpired behind the backs of the advancing battalions and outside the walls of the staff meetings. When the white flag finally rose over the river Vid and tens of thousands of starving Ottoman soldiers laid down their arms, the military objective was achieved. But, in reality, another equally grueling struggle began. The battle against epidemics, horrific wounds, and total logistical collapse. In the winter of 1877, Plevna and its surrounding villages morphed into one gigantic, improvised hospital. By the time of Osman Pasha's capitulation, tens of thousands of wounded and sick men from both sides had accumulated inside the Russian ring. The military medical service, which had planned for a much shorter campaign, was struck by a colossal overload. It was precisely here, into these agonizing conditions, that a man arrived whose name meant just as much for saving lives as the names of generals meant for taking them. Nikolai Ivanovich Pirogov, the preeminent Russian surgeon and one of the founding fathers of field surgery, was about 67 years old at the time. He was no longer young, but when he was invited to help organize medical care in this theater of war, he agreed without a moment's hesitation. Pirogov inspected hospitals from the Danube all the way to Plevna under brutal winter conditions. What he saw shocked even him, a hardened veteran of the Crimean War. Typhus, dysentery, and hospital gangrene were claiming countless lives. The wounded often lay in unheated spaces in terrifyingly cramped conditions. Pirogov aggressively implemented the principles of triage, a system he had pioneered during the defense of Sevastopol. He demanded the strict separation of infectious patients from the wounded, fought for urgent improvements in sanitation, and established a much more organized system for evacuating patients to the rear. Working shoulder to shoulder with Pirogov were people whose labor fundamentally altered the era's traditional views on the role of women in society. Sisters of Mercy, nurses, headed to this front en masse in highly significant numbers. Among them were not just the wives and relatives of military officers, but women representing all social classes, including high aristocracy. They stood for hours beside operating tables, assisted surgeons, and cared for the severely wounded. They scrubbed blood-soaked bandages in freezing water and tended to typhus patients, constantly risking their own infection. Many Sisters of Mercy did indeed contract terrible infectious diseases during this service, and a portion of them did not survive the campaign. Their labor at Plevna became a highly visible example of how war temporarily erased the rigid social boundaries between people of different backgrounds. This war differed from previous conflicts of the empire in yet another monumental way. It was the first major war that Russian society could follow in relatively short timeframes as events unfolded. The expansion of telegraph communications dramatically altered the relationship between the front and the home front. While news of earlier campaigns sometimes took weeks to arrive, dispatches from the front were now frequently published in metropolitan newspapers within just a few days. For the first time, professional war correspondents working directly alongside the active army played a massive role. Their reports were not always sanitized or pleasant. They described the catastrophic casualties at the Gravitsa redoubt, the sheer misery of the winter standoff at Shipka, the glaring flaws in the planning of specific operations, and the nightmarish conditions in the field hospitals. The educated stratum of Russian society followed these publications with rapt attention. War ceased to be viewed as a distant, abstract affair concerning only the sovereign and the military establishment. It barged directly into the daily lives of countless families. This unprecedented informational proximity to the front sparked a massive public response. Across the entire nation, donations were collected for medicine, warm clothing, and bandages. Some members of educated circles went to the front themselves as volunteers or as Sisters of Mercy. The moods of this period were vividly reflected in the literature of the time, where the themes of volunteerism and personal participation in this war were repeatedly explored. But the longer the brutal fighting at Plevna dragged on, the more complex society's attitude toward the events became. The initial burst of enthusiasm gradually gave way to a much heavier, sobering realization of the true cost of military action. The writer Vsevolod Garshin, who personally fought in this war as a volunteer and was wounded, later wrote a famous short story titled 4 Days. It contains no grandiose musings on high strategy or grand politics. It is the intimate story of a wounded Russian soldier who spends several days lying on the battlefield next to the rotting corpse of an enemy he himself killed, contemplating the utter senselessness of this mutual slaughter between two men who, in civilian life, were fundamentally peaceful people. This story made a profound impression on the reading public, which had grown accustomed mainly to drier, official military dispatches. War appeared before society not merely as a source of national pride, but as an agonizing fountain of profound personal suffering for multitudes of people. Plevna largely fostered a much more complex, far less naive understanding of the true image of war as a whole. The officers and soldiers who returned from the Balkans were, in many respects, changed men. They had witnessed not only extraordinary heroism, but also the glaring organizational failures of certain commanders, many of whom had been appointed based on formal social standing rather than genuine military merit. Many of these returning men, having actively participated in the liberation of the Bulgarian people and having assisted in the implementation of the quite progressive, for its time, Bulgarian constitution, inevitably began to reflect on their own political status in their homeland, where a massive portion of the population was deprived of comparable political rights. This internal contradiction carried severe consequences for the subsequent history of the empire. The Russian army had massively contributed to winning greater political freedom for the Balkans, yet inside Russia itself, the system of state governance remained largely exactly as it had been. The decisions of the Congress of Berlin, which sliced away a large portion of the war's conquests, further amplified the stinging sense of injustice among segments of society. The deep disillusionment that accumulated after Plevna and the Congress of Berlin became a significant catalyst contributing to the surge of radical political sentiments within the country in the following years. A specific segment of educated society began to view the necessity for urgent political change with growing sympathy, which subsequently manifested in the activities of various opposition and radical movements of that era. It is worth noting separately that the fate of Emperor Alexander II himself following this war ended in sheer tragedy. A few years after the conclusion of hostilities in 1881, he was assassinated in St. Petersburg in a bombing orchestrated by members of a radical underground movement. This occurred shortly after the emperor had begun considering specific steps toward expanding representative elements in the governance of the country. History demonstrated, with agonizing irony,
just how volatile the relationship could be between massive military triumphs abroad and turbulent internal political processes within the empire itself. But if we peel away the high politics, the diplomatic maneuvering of the great powers, and the subsequent domestic upheavals, what truly remains at the very core of this entire history?
What remains is the indelible image of the ordinary Russian infantryman, the man in the grey greatcoat who never read diplomatic cables and never took part in grand strategic debates. He was told that there was an enemy up ahead on the hill who needed to be driven from his position, and he simply went to execute that order. He marched into the assault, slipping on clay in the sweltering July heat, while a wall of enemy fire mowed down the ranks of his comrades. He lay freezing in a flooded trench under the autumn rains, surviving on meagre rations. He froze to the bone on the mountain passes in December, throwing his weight into dragging artillery pieces through waist-deep snow. He suffered from typhus in overflowing hospitals, frequently without uttering a single complaint about his fate. He did all of this, driven largely by a deeply rooted sense of martial duty, a sentiment that foreign observers sometimes misinterpreted as incomprehensible fatalism, but which was, in reality, a specific brand of stoic endurance, forged by the incredibly harsh living conditions of that era. Western military observers attached to the Russian army repeatedly noted in their dispatches, often with sheer bewilderment, that Russian units, having suffered catastrophic casualties in an attack one day, were entirely ready to follow the command's orders and attack again the very next morning. They attributed this to various things: iron discipline, an ingrained habituation to severe hardship, or the unique nature of their upbringing. Most likely, it was a complex combination of all these factors, heavily anchored by a collective, unshakable belief that there existed obligations vastly more important than one's own personal well-being. It was these very men, often barely literate, possessing zero understanding of the nuances of high diplomacy, who ultimately decided the outcome of this agonizing, blood-soaked campaign. They took Plevna at the cost of unimaginable effort. They crossed the snow-choked Balkans. They forced Osman Pasha in the end to lay down his arms. Today, looking back at the events of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, from the height of the decades that have passed, Plevna remains one of the most significant and, in its own way, darkest episodes of that entire campaign. It was the definitive moment when older conceptions of warfare, resting on the experiences of the previous century, violently gave way to completely new realities. Realities in which the role of field fortification, rapid-firing weaponry, and methodical, exhausting siege warfare grew exponentially. Plevna graphically proved that a highly prepared position and modern weaponry could dramatically level the playing field, allowing a vastly numerically inferior garrison to stand against a massively larger foe. Yet this exact same history also proved that the relentless determination of the attacking side, multiplied by patient organizational logistics and a methodical blockade, is ultimately capable of breaking even the most brilliantly conceived defense. The history of Plevna is not just a dry ledger of dates and casualty statistics. It is the history of concrete decisions made by concrete people. Osman Pasha demonstrated phenomenal willpower and outstanding engineering genius in creating his defense. Totleben demonstrated equally immense willpower and pure professionalism, methodically strangling that defense with an iron ring of blockade. Skobelev repeatedly showcased incredible personal resolve and courage in the most nightmarish combat conditions, while hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers on both sides simply did what was demanded of them, paying an incredibly steep price. The destinies of the primary participants in this history played out in entirely different ways, and in those differences there is also a certain logic. Osman Pasha, despite his ultimate defeat at Plevna, returned to the Ottoman Empire not as a disgraced commander, but as a universally recognized hero. His 5-month defense deeply impressed even his own command and the Sultan's court. The sheer resilience of his garrison was valued far higher than the inevitable fact of its capitulation. Osman Pasha received the honorary title of Ghazi, traditionally awarded to exceptionally distinguished military leaders. Subsequently held prominent positions at court, including the post of Minister of War, and lived to a ripe old age, passing away at the turn of the century as a highly respected man. For the Ottoman Empire, the defense of Plevna became one of the very few sources of genuine military pride in a war that ultimately concluded in a severe defeat for them. The fate of Mikhail Skobelev proved much shorter and far more tragic. After the war, he continued his military career, participating in campaigns in Central Asia, and gained massive popularity in Russian society as one of the most brilliant and dashing commanders of his era. But he did not live long. In 1882, at the young age of 38, he died suddenly in Moscow, under circumstances that contemporaries and subsequent historians were never able to explain completely and exhaustively. The official version cited sudden heart failure. However, rumors of possible foul play surrounded his name for many years to come. His premature death robbed the Russian army of one of the most gifted tacticians of his generation, whose hard-won practical experience, forged in the fires of Plevna, could have significantly influenced the future development of Russian military thought had he lived longer. Plevna, as a direct military episode, has long since receded into the past. Those who remembered it firsthand have long since passed away, and the memory of the specific individuals involved is slowly fading. But the historical experience that was forged in blood on the gentle hills of that Bulgarian town retains its profound significance for military historians to this very day. It stands as an eternal testament to just how astonishingly fragile human life becomes in the face of modern weaponry, and just how incredibly immense human resilience can be when there is absolutely no other choice left but to continue the fight.